the frontline worker was in a remote session with his IT support help desk administrator from back end of the office. And in course of that remote session, there was a man in the middle attack, and someone had taken over the session, right? The frontline worker actually observed the mouse cursor moving to actually increase the sodium hydroxide level in the water treatment plant from 100 parts per million to 1100 parts per million. That actually could have been responsible for poisoning the entire city. Kudos to him that he alerted and was able to avert that kind of a biodiversity. So what we're really talking about is that identity-centric attacks are not only business risks, or, as some of the reports have said, that it costs about $4.35 million per data breach. But it's not only about business risk or dollar value, it's actually a risk to lives and livelihoods of people. A similar attack that happened on the ransomware attack happened on the Colonial Pipeline, which is responsible for about 45% of all the petroleum transportation in the East Coast of the United States. Resulted in the entire pipeline being caught to ransom, right? Also caused due to a single credential theft. Now, imagine the kind of critical infrastructure that can be taken over, and the kind of impact it can have on the entire city at large, right? So lives and livelihoods of people is what we're talking about that are at stake when it comes to any kind of credential theft or identity-centric attack. So there are many other such examples we can talk about, but this really brings in perspective why one needs to protect identity, which is actually the point of integration of all zero trust elements that organizations can think of, right? And that's where, when it comes to basic principles and strategies of zero trust, one looks at verifying explicitly, one looks at least privileged access controls with just-in-time privileges. And finally, the third pillar around assuming that a breach will happen, do you have resiliency aspects put in play or not? So those are some elements around what organizations need to think of when they look at people, processes, and technologies coming together in the integration of an identity-centric security approach. And that's what the framework of identity threat detection and response also talks about, because it is believed that no single solution, no single product can actually solve all the ITDR requirements. It has to be a convergence of it, along with the amalgamation of people, processes, and technologies coming together. Some of the trends that put renewed emphasis on identity-centric security and solutions that look at a more identity lifecycle management, from provisioning, deprovisioning, to any kind of role-based access controls, to even authentication and authorization mechanisms. Some of the trends and market trends that talk about it are around third-party and remote working arrangements, right? So if you look at post-COVID working scenarios, I think there is more distributed work cultures, remote working, work from home being a norm for the last 3 years. This calls for protection around having remote access control governances and ensuring that the entire lifecycle management of not just your human identities, but also non-human identities need to be put in place. When we look at convergence of it, we are actually looking at human identities, non-human identities, or digital identities, and digital assets all coming into play, right? It has to be looked at from a perspective that your digital identities and your digital assets, which could mean your business applications or your critical IT infrastructure, needs to be mapped back onto a human identity. That's where the essence of human beings having control over the automation comes in place. Please be aware that automation is created by human beings. It's not the other way around. And we need to have human beings in control of automation, in control of AI, ML concepts, or even your bots or identities that are around applications and bots, right? So your digital identities could mean machine identities, your any kind of APIs, bots, applications, or even interactive and non-interactive identities. But it needs to be mapped back into ownership and custodianship of a human being. And that is the essence of how identities are mapped back to a single source of truth of either your HRMS or any kind of an identity creation, and then managed across its entire life cycle. The framework around a converged platform needs to also bring into perspective a zero trust element, as I talked about, from a passwordless approach to single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, geo-tagging location specific aspects that bring into perspective essentially explicit verification controls and least privilege with just-in-time controls, right? With role-based and risk-based adaptive controls as well. So the zero trust layer within the platform is what one needs to look into more closely. Some of the other trends are around moving to a cloud or a SaaS-based application in course of digital transformation, right? And Andrew, since you're here, I'd like to gain your perspective around from a cloud security standpoint. What are your thought processes around cloud infrastructure vis-a-vis entitlements and management of privileged access controls on cloud infrastructure? If you can throw some light on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're seeing a lot of questions around this, right? The most relevant ones are, how you're able to actually, look at identities, right? And identity roles and permissions and entitlements across basically for admin users for two kinds of separate entities or resources. One is access to the cloud infrastructure, infrastructure as a service, admin policies, right? Because obviously if an admin has access to admin policies, then they can kind of open and make their way for themselves to gain access to other things, right? So that's one group of access points, right? The other area is basically getting access to data, right? So that was, how an admin user as well as a business user can get access to data. And a lot of times this is not trivial, right? So this is the interesting thing about cloud infrastructure, that you do not have like a direct access control list for a user. Actually, you do, but even if that access control list precludes this admin from accessing that data, there may be indirect or transitive paths for that admin user to the data. For example, if a user has access to a privileged EC2 instance, right, but does not have access to an S3 bucket, for example, AWS, because the user's access to that EC2 instance, right, and then the fact that that EC2 instance is have privileged access point to the S3 bucket, the user will basically in end result have high privilege access to the to the S3 bucket and the sensitive data there.
Yeah, from a cloud security posture management perspective as well, we've been seeing more and more adoption of multi-cloud environments, right? So gone are the days where organizations were just adopting maybe only an AWS or an Azure. It's a mixture of AWS, Azure, GCP, OCI, and the likes, and not just restricting to cloud infrastructure environments of sorts, but also SaaS applications. It could be n number of applications like Salesforce, GitHub, Confluence coming together, right? I don't think the answer to who has access to what and where in a single view window as a visibility perspective for leadership and analytics is still in play when it comes to your cloud security posture management. So I think the answer lies in a robust cloud infrastructure and entitlements management solution and a cloud security posture management solution. Again, it all comes down to having the right people, processes, and technologies, as you rightly said, having visibility around the privileged access to these cloud environments as well, right? So that's an interesting area of discussion and a lot of feedback that we've received from customers as they have in their journeys of digital transformation with multi-cloud environments. There's also rapid and accelerated growth on non-human identities. So Andros, any thoughts around those? Of course, I've covered a little around automation, AI, ML, bot-based identities as well.
Yeah. So machine identities are really difficult, right, for a number of reasons, right? First of all, if a machine identity is being hijacked by a human being or a hacker, right, it basically can have the exact same high privileges as if it was a human high privileged user accessing resources, right? So that's one thing. High privileged identities typically are embedded, or secrets or credentials may be embedded in many parts of the infrastructure for obviously convenience reasons, or just pure oversight reasons, right? So that's another kind of challenging part here. And then the last thing that I would say about machine identities, which makes them a little bit easier to kind of handle than high privileged human users, right, is that machine identities typically, when they're being used in a normal fashion, right, a machine identity is typically used over and over for the same kind of purpose and the same pattern, right? You're like, only reading a certain resource, right, or a storage element, using that high privileged identity, right? Machine identity. So if that high privileged identity is doing something completely different, right, that is usually a sign of a problem and challenge there, right? So that is something that is happening there, and so the behavioral detection of anomalies for machine identities can be a little bit easier. Let's just put it this way: can be a little bit easier than detecting anomalies in behaviors for high privileged human identity.
For sure. So that's an interesting point you picked on from a behavioral analytics perspective, and I'll just come to that. I think in context to that, if I could first cover around the real largest threat surface that organizations are exposed to, still happens to be their endpoints and end users, right? So in a typical life cycle of an attack, I believe,
Gautam, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you, Gautam. I just wanted to put this that all of you who are questioning on the chat and sharing us questions, Gautam and Andras will address those questions once we are completed with our detailed webinar and what the discussion is going on. They will answer each and every query. Okay. Please, Gautam, continue.
Sure. So coming down to endpoints, Andros, and which end users still happens to be the largest attack surface for organizations at large. And if you look at it, in a typical adversary would like to enter through some kind of a social engineering or a phishing attack through the end users, and those are typically an audience that is probably lesser aware and educated in the culturally in terms of security. And once that access is gained, the adversary would typically lay low, persist within the organization, have a low profile, understand the segmentation, user identities, or even from an environment standpoint, and then try to move laterally once they've gained certain amount of a privileged control or take over a privileged identity, right? Which are, of course, coveted credentials here. Your thought process around how can the first point of that attack itself be prevented, protected, or
I mean, there's definitely on endpoints, right? You really have to have enterprise mobility management and really an enterprise device management type of things, right? So if an endpoint is compromised, like using a phishing attack, like even if it's a personally owned device, right? And the attack is not even against the organization. Attackers would typically find stored credentials, logged in sessions in browsers and other similar things that will allow them to sidestep and move laterally into deeper and deeper echelons of the enterprise, right? And because of this, or layers of the enterprise, because of this, having a robust posture on the endpoint, enterprise mobility management, as well as enterprise asset management. So both for mobile devices, smartphones, tablets, as well as for traditional PCs and Macs or desktop computers. Yeah. You definitely want to have, if it's a laptop, some kind of an asset management. If it's a desktop machine, you may get away if it's a desktop machine and that's in an office of a corporate office, then you can do things like network access control and all the IP address based limitations, right? But I think the general trend that we're seeing these days is moving towards more like enterprise mobility management and enterprise asset management kinds of tools, right, that allow you to kind of control devices.
No, absolutely. And I think another important point you brought about from a privilege standpoint is that it's a security versus operational balance that we've heard our customers saying in terms of having zero standing privileges and organizations at end user endpoint levels, right? But I think if one invests in a robust endpoint privilege management solution that can actually ensure that there is elevation and delegation on demand for with least privilege access controls with just-in-time privileges given to end users only when they need that particular task to be done, maybe some kind of a administrative task, right? That's something that can help them in actually achieving zero standing privileges by default. And this could be coupled with endpoint protection mechanisms like blacklisting, whitelisting controls for not just applications, but also processes for any kind of endpoint privileges for pen drives and the sort. So there are different nuances when it comes to endpoints, as you, I think, largely talked about, that one needs to be looking at, and that's an interesting field to explore further as well. But that brings me to the next question of what you covered for behavioral analytics, because I don't think when it comes to endpoints and users, the surface is so large that there is really no manual intervention that is practical, right? You cannot triage that volume of information. You cannot manage the number of incidents that could be reported. How do you bring in AI ML? How do you bring in automation to look at behavioral aspects of users, to look at really intelligence built into even data-centric security? Any thoughts around that, Anshus?
So basically, you really need to kind of understand the user's access rights, right, to other resources, right? Mm-hmm. And those other resources may be, things like admin policies. They may be access to compute resources like EC2 or virtual machines or Google Compute, kind of instances. They may be to resources that are storage, right? So S3 buckets, block storage, Microsoft blobs, Azure blobs, etc., right? And network artifacts, right? So, VPCs, VPNs, and various other kind of networking policies to understand, basically the network access of the endpoint or the user, right? Yeah. And then you have to basically query and then continue this exploration or discovery, right, until you reach sensitive resources and sensitive endpoints, right? So this is basically the process, Gotham, that you basically described, right? That this is not a manually feasible or even process, right? You cannot use an Excel spreadsheet manual processes because the variability and the number of kind of paths, you can think of it as a graph, right? And the number of, pathways through this graph or a maze, if you will, is just huge, right? And discovering these paths between the user, right, and the sensitive data is really something. I mean, you may be able to discover certain things manually and then just kind of by eyeballing, what the user has access to and what their access control lists are on the sensitive data storage are. But the full discovery is just not going to be possible, right? And so, and then there's definitely the static nature of all this, and then there's the behavioral nature, which means that a user's access, right, the human admin user's access, will be largely, kind of limited in terms of what they have to do, in conjunction with their job, right? I mean, an admin user would be, maybe creating some virtual machines, maybe, kind of using some authorized data assets, right, storage and traversing through well understood networks, right? But in reality, what can also happen, right, in this thing, that if a user's entity is hijacked or is being used by an unauthorized person, then you might be seeing behaviors that are completely out of line and maybe going through different paths, right, of this connected graph, right, than what they would be doing normally, if that makes
absolutely
sense.
I think role-based and profile-based behaviors are something that are built into technologies that one is developing these days, looking at market requirements, right? So user behavior analytics from a perspective of understanding each and every user's behavior over a period of time, locking their profile to be able to work only within those gamuts of things, right? So if Gautam comes into office every day at say 9:30 in the morning, leaves by 6:30, has a typical work, behavior by accessing maybe 10 different websites in a day, 5 different software he works on, 3 different applications on a daily basis. Maybe work, fills this timesheet once in a week, accesses the HRMS application once in a month. That kind of a profile is defined for him after the system actually learns that over a period of time. From there on, if the profile is locked to that and Gautam is trying to suddenly access an application that he's never accessed before at an odd hour in the night, that is an anomaly, right? So detecting anomalies in behavior in itself is the first line of questioning why this is being done. So, and one can throw in response mechanisms like throwing in a multi-factor authentication, a challenge to secrets governance, secrets management for that regard. And there are a host of controls that can really follow in. So I think that's the way to go in terms of automating that entire process for organizations at large.
Multi-factor authentication is definitely something we're seeing, a lot of requirements for, and identifying all the accounts and credentials, admin and business user, that do not have multi-factor authentication is definitely a huge challenge in and of itself, but it's a major task, right, around securing cloud.
Absolutely. And we believe the next level of convergence from this could be that now that one has user context from understanding the behavior of the end user, if you take in data-centric security also in perspective and now bring in the data context, right? If you can have technologies to recognize endpoint data at a contextual level, right? So you understand that these are, say, legal case file documents lying in this particular machine. This is a PII information. This is finance-related information. You categorize them, you classify them, and you contextualize them. We believe that convergence really lies in bringing in elements of IAM, PAM, IGA, associated identity-centric security solutions, and contextual data models in play. So there's an element of identity-centric security with data-centric security coming in, and a convergence of user context with data context marrying each other. I think that is where a lot of the protect, prevent, and proactive governance measures can really help organizations respond to such threats. Yeah. So with that, I think, Andros, we've covered a good set of real pertinent topics around zero trust and identity-centric security. We'd probably like to leave it open to audience for some time around Q&A, unless you have any specific aspects to further cover in this. Otherwise, there are some questions that have been posted we could probably take on if you're good with that.
Yep, definitely. So, let's hear those questions.
Yep, let's just run through this. What is the most common identity theft, asks Prakash. Interesting. I think, so Andros, if you'd like to take that on first, and then maybe I can throw in my thoughts around that.
So what's the question? Sorry, once more.
What is the most common identity theft?
Theft. Okay, identity theft. I mean, typically in these environments, right, it's basically using a phishing attack, right, that is from the consumer space, right, gain kind of steal some credentials of the user, and then basically once you have access to a laptop, you install rootkit, install some kind of a backdoor on the individual's endpoint, right? And then basically once you have that endpoint, entry to the individual's endpoint, then look around for various stored secrets and kind of credentials that allow access to, say, an AWS or Azure or GCP environment. And then once that is discovered, right, a lot of times the machine is part of a corporate, single sign-on system. Once that is established, then the hackers can log into, the corporate system, and then through that to AWS, Azure, GCP consoles, and basically move around there laterally.
Absolutely. I think that's the life cycle we also talked about, Prakash. The easiest way typically to get into is from the largest threat surface that is there in terms of the end users, but then move through the segmentation of identities and users and come to ultimately the coveted identity, which should typically be a privileged credential, right? That will allow them to really change configurations, open up ports, as Andros mentioned, even gain access to critical IT infrastructure within the organization, which could be on the cloud as well, or data centers as well, right? I think he has a couple of follow-up questions to that, and who is most at risk for identity theft and who really catches these identity thefts? So I think Andros covered a large part of that already. The organization at large is most at risk, but it's not just business risk, but also life and livelihoods, as I started off with saying. And when it comes to privileged credentials, I think that's where eventually an adversary would want to get at. So when we look at an 80-20 rule, it is in the interest of the organization to first protect the privileged credentials, and then, of course, move down to every type of identity, be it human and non-human as well.
I definitely agree. The privileged identities are the heaviest hitters, right? And have a largest blast radius if they're compromised, right? For sure. And that's what every hacker wants to kind of get to anyway, right? When they kind of do a lateral movement.
For sure.
I would also add one thing here that is not immediately trivial. Managing entitlement risk, cloud infrastructure entitlement, and privileged users is not only a challenge in production environments, right? The challenge here is that, or issue at hand here is that a lot of times production data is used in non-production environments, or there's linkages between production and non-production environments, right? Which should not be there, right? Like production environments should not be connected to non-production environments, and production data should not be used in non-production environments, right? But the reality of the story is that we do see this. So that really kind of draws our attention, right, to non-production environment protections, right? So protecting the production environment is the first step, but we definitely recommend extending coverage at some level to non-production environments as well.
Certainly. I think a very pertinent point brought up, Andres. And slightly related to this, since you brought up, it came to my point, is also that when we are looking at protection of critical IT infrastructure, it needs to be looked at from production as well as HA and DR, and all of this needing to be in sync is equally important when it comes to security posturing, right? So yeah, that's an interesting perspective there. Just browse through some other questions. So Michael has a question that says, to what extent do services like Okta satisfactorily address the concerns with managing logins to multiple services?
Okay.
Think it's around more of lifecycle management and governance around that.
I think so, yeah. So basically these services have been penetration tested, right? And then they have a really good control over second factor authentication, risk-based authentication, identity, analytics, risk, threat, management, and all this other good stuff. Yes, there had been some challenges in the past, right, around these services, right? I would say there will always be social engineering attacks, and there will always be kind of gullible admins and gullible people in the human chain, right? That is just the reality. I think the important thing is to kind of structure these environments in such a way that you can actually limit and control the blast radius, right? That is, I guess, so even if there's a compromise, you're able to contain that attack, relatively well.
For sure, yes. I think even from the zero trust strategies perspective, the last pillar that I talked about was around assuming that a breach will happen. How are you able to contain that breach and actually bounce back? Do you have resiliency mechanisms put in place? Do you have AI/ML-based threat detection and response systems that can actually help you do some sort of a fraud investigative approach to coming back to normalcy and have visibility and analytics in play in line with zero trust principles, right? So interesting perspective there. Alvin has a question which says, which is usually a better approach, a centralized role-based management for an application or local application role-based management? Interesting.
I would say, containing problems and threats using, applications, right, and kind of understanding the application risk framework.
Yeah.
That is definitely a, kind of problem, and I think looking at these application-centric risks is very, very critical, right? So it's a good way of encapsulating things, right? But a lot of times, you kind of have to look beyond the applications. But we've seen a lot of organizations that are looking and trying to solve these problems from the application risk perspective and from the application compartmentalization perspective. Another kind of best practice that we've seen is to use containerization, right? Like containers are obviously a cloud on top of your cloud platform, like in the public cloud, AWS, Azure, GCP. So using a good and well thought out, protected, containerized architecture is always good.
Yep. That just led me to think a little off track from this question, but because it talks about approaches, and we did talk about convergence of a platform as an approach towards identity-centric security. While I talked about coming together of an IAM, PAM, IGA, Enterprise Vault, MFA, SSO solutions all coming together in a single native platform, we do believe that organizations would not rip and replace each of these disparate and siloed solutions at the same time, right? It's not that overnight they would do away with all of their existing technologies and have a converged platform. I think it's what we call an identity journey. It's something they'd like to begin with, but be able to piecemeal add on to the particular platform. They have to have the platform in place, but be able to add on to that story modularly as they proceed with their identity journey, right? So I think there needs to be enablement of a system that is more microservice in nature, that'll allow adding specific product modules within the platform as time progresses. We have a question from Yusuf as well, which says that ITDR focuses on threats directly to IAM systems. But what about other identity threats? And it's a bit of a long question, so I'll break it up and we'll probably answer it piecemeal. So talking of that part, Yusuf, I think I totally agree. ITDR doesn't only talk about specific problem statements pertaining to identity-centric security. It also talks about protecting the systems in itself, right? So having protective mechanisms to the IAM system, to a specific PAM system, and ensuring that there's a bounce back mechanism to even kind of a threat that could happen on those systems in itself. Andres, would you like to throw any light on this first part of the question?
Yeah, so basically threat detection is definitely important, right? If it's in the construct of the cloud environment, right, and privileges and entitlements. I think looking at not just cloud environments, but extending the scope to legacy identity systems, legacy privileged identity management systems, or legacy identity management and governance or IGA solutions is always in play, kind of very much a good idea and best practice.
So he continues saying that, for example, when we talk about the systems inspecting behavioral anomaly, it is called a risk-based authentication, but not ITDR. But from an overall perspective, an attack to an identity in an IAM system, also an attack to IAM system in itself. Isn't there a confusion? What are your thoughts? Yeah, I think it's a good perspective for everyone to actually share thoughts around this. I think the thought process is a little confused in the market in itself, and what is one trying to protect needs to be really defined along with the life cycle of it. It can't be point in time, but ensuring that the entire life cycle from provisioning to deprovisioning is also taken care of, and the system in itself is protected.
Yeah, I mean, the identity system usually is a warehouse, right, of very valuable and a lot of times sensitive information itself, right? So it tells basically, if it's a governance system, who gained access to what and who gets access to what, right? you can also think of the AWS, Azure, GCP, and other kind of cloud consoles and cloud infrastructure, and these identity management systems that control the privileges and entitlements and access rights to cloud resources are also identity systems, right? But there's also, your traditional, SailPoint, Savient, and other kinds of, on-prem identity management and governance tools, right? And if they're attacked, you can dump out the details. You can kind of gain a lot of access in the infrastructure and as well as the architecture of the environment, like interconnectivity, as well as the overall blueprint of the enterprise looks like from the application perspective. I would also mention, kind of looking at privileged systems, right? If an unauthorized access is being made to a privileged identity management system, that's a problem in and of itself, because not only because of the credentials can be stolen, but also because of these tools also provide a unparalleled level of detail into the infrastructure and the architecture of the environment that you're trying to protect, right? So it's the map, right, of everything.
I'd like to add a governance aspect to that from an IGA standpoint for governance and administration. I think while we may be able to manage the life cycle of identities, it's also important to periodically ensure that there's certification and recertification of these access controls in play, right? So that's another element of what Yusuf has also brought out in this in an interesting question, is that what lies today need not be true tomorrow, right? There is a period of time during which certain individuals may need access to certain environments, to certain applications, but as roles change, it is the entire JML process that needs to be managed throughout. And with role changes that may happen across joining, moving, and leaving the organization, there may be certification and recertification requirements with approval mechanisms put in place. And there needs to be automation around it with a more, how we look at it as a bot-based approach towards even collecting all these information around access controls around applications and assets. So those are the questions that have been posted so far on the chat that I see. And we are almost at the top of the hour as well, Andros. Unless there's any other question that you have in mind, we can continue with some closing statements and wrap this webinar.
I think there's a lot of in terms of, from my perspective, there's a lot of different aspects, right, and layers of all this, right? It's not just a singular attack surface. Unfortunately, it's fragmented and multi-layered, and each layer has its protections and containment, kind of techniques, for sure.
For sure. Thanks so much, Andros. This is the second conversation that I know we are having in the last 6 months, and it's always been a privilege, pun intended. It's been a discussion around privileges as well, but it's always been a privilege to actually talk to you. And thanks so much for your insights. I hope the audience enjoyed this insightful session, and looking forward to more. We'll keep you posted of more such webinars that ARCON and Forrester bring together.
Thank you, Gautam and Andras. It was nice having you on the floor. And secondly, thank you once again, for giving your precious time and a very wisdom-based approach related to identity, threat detection, and response. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.